Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about how to write an A+ paper like a lawyer in a courtroom. If you've got a paper coming up that requires you to make a persuasive argument, then this video is for you. So I want you to imagine that you're a lawyer in a courtroom. The author or the text that you're responding to is the defendant, and you are going to build a case and convince the jury to side in your favor. In my video on 3 questions to ask yourself when writing an essay, I started with the most important question and the area where I see students fall into trouble the most often, which is not responding to the prompt. So if you're a lawyer in a courtroom, you can't have baseless accusations. You have to build your case by gathering evidence and presenting it in a logical and persuasive way, and that's exactly what we're going to learn how to do today. The first step in any trial by jury is something called voir dire. Voir dire means to tell the truth, and this is where lawyers have the opportunity to interview potential jury members to see whether or not they have any kind of biases that would make them not a good fit for evaluating this case. We're going to do the same thing by looking at what information you've already been given, and in particular, from your professor. Think about, does your professor have any particular areas where they are biased for or against something? Every professor is different, and they have different expectations of their students. But it's not a mystery what those expectations are if you've been going to class and taking notes. So the first thing to do would be take a look at what information has already been given to you and investigate whether or not you're approaching your essay, your argument, in the right way. Is there an essay assignment? What are the directions on that assignment? Have you been discussing any particular writing strategies in class? For example, does this professor want you to use outside evidence, such as research that you do on your own? Is this professor asking you to respond directly to a text that maybe you read in class? What kinds of things have they focused on? For example, professors might introduce you to various rhetorical strategies, and they want you to apply those rhetorical strategies to your essay writing. And this is exactly what information we can find out by doing a little bit of investigation before we start to gather our evidence and form our argument. If you're not sure what your professor is looking for in this essay, there's a few places you can start. There's probably a handout or any type of description of what the essay assignment is. Start there. That might also include something like a rubric that shows you what it is you're going to be evaluated on. This is an excellent tool to use before you start to form your argument. What kinds of things are you going to be evaluated on? And that is where you want to begin. In fact, I often recommend to my students that they sort of reverse engineer their essay based on looking at the grading criteria, looking at the rubric, and saying, this is what we're focused on for this particular assignment. Some professors also provide samples of what they're looking for, like perhaps a sample essay or maybe an excerpt from something like a sample of a body paragraph that shows what they're looking for in terms of both structure and content. And if neither of those things are provided, that's a great question to ask your professor in office hours. A hot tip that not many students take advantage of is during office hours, professors are often really willing to guide you in terms of what it is they're looking for and help you start to form an appropriate response to the topic that's going to get rid of all of that sort of fear and anxiety that comes before we get started that often can lead to procrastination. And in addition to that, if you go to your professor's office hours and you talk about what you're thinking of doing in approaching this essay and you ask, is there anything else I should know? That professor is going to have it in mind that you really care about this subject and you want to do well in this class and in particular on that assignment. And that's going to come into play when they're grading your paper. Trust me, I know. The next step is something in legal terms that's called the theory of the case. This is where you're going to figure out all the various sides of the argument that could be made, and you're going to identify what exactly it is that you want to move forward with when it comes to building your case. So you're going to lay out all the various arguments that you could potentially make when it comes to writing this persuasive essay, and you're going to start to form your own theory of the case, and that's going to lead directly into the argument that you will be making in your essay that for most students is going to take the form of a thesis statement. So if you've heard that term before, you can think of it as the overall argument that the entire essay is building towards making, and ultimately when you get to the conclusion has been effectively conveyed to the audience in a persuasive manner. But before we get to that, we have to build the case first. And that leads us directly to step number 3. The best method to writing an A paper like a lawyer is to spend time building your understanding of the various sides of the argument before you choose what it is you are going to argue. In step number 3, you're going to start to build your case by gathering the relevant evidence. That might involve taking a look at your notes and perhaps reading over any annotations you might have taken related to the text. Is there any previous assignment that you've worked on that could help contribute to the argument you're making? A lot of times writing essays often involves various steps along the way that students don't necessarily see the connection between these ideas. So have you had to do any sort of short form writing assignments where you respond to an element of the text already? Or perhaps have there been discussions related to this topic? Take a look at those. Gather all of your evidence and figure out what might make a good basis for your claim that you're going to make. The key witness of this case is the main source that you're responding to in this essay. For a lot of college-level writing, essays are expository, which means they are responding to a specific text. That might be a book that you've read, a poem, a short story, perhaps even a film, or a topic of discussion. For example, in a history class, it might be a period of time. So take a look at what is your key witness. Where is it that you're going to gather the strongest evidence for your case? Another thing to keep in mind at this phase in writing an A paper like a lawyer is to consider what is inadmissible to the court. For example, if your professor explicitly says do not use outside sources or please only use sources assigned in this class, then consider any other outside sources, for example, research you might want to do on your own. That research is going to be hearsay and that will be tossed out of court. So pay attention to what are the expectations around where you're going to be deriving your evidence. Is there a key witness, aka a main source, from which you should pull your evidence? In step 4, we're not going to forget about the fact that on the other side of the courtroom, there is the opposing counsel. So you can consider what is the counter-argument to the claim that you are making in your persuasive essay, and you can do something that is called planting a naysayer. It might seem like a paradox, but it actually can increase your credibility as a persuasive writer to explore what might be the opposite argument, or in a lot of classes is referred to as the counter-argument. So in part of your essay, you can choose to, if it's allowed, to include the counter-argument. For example, something along the lines of, others may argue X, but ultimately Y is more persuasive for these reasons, okay? We don't really necessarily want to use that as a template, but that's essentially what we're doing. So think about the counter-arguments that could be made. What kind of holes in your thinking or logic could someone poke? And that's when you are going to counter that counter argument by ultimately coming back around to the strength of your argument, which increases your credibility as a persuasive writer and would increase the credibility of a lawyer in a courtroom to sort of object or to refute the claims of the opposing counsel. And finally, step 5, we are going to draw a larger conclusion so that beyond reasonable doubt, we have persuaded our audience. And what this looks like is looking at the bigger picture. Think about that lawyer in a courtroom. They're creating their closing remarks. It's their last opportunity to convince the judge or the jury of the strength of their case. What they're ultimately going to do is to show, why does this all matter? What's the bigger picture? What is the key thing that we want everyone who's reading this essay to take away as they move on from this topic? So think about that jury full of jurors, and what message or what ultimate persuasive argument do you want them to have absorbed from your overall case that you've laid out here today, and what do you want them to be thinking as they go into seclusion for their deliberation? And ultimately, if you provide them with a persuasive argument beyond reasonable doubt, you'll have written an A paper in the style of a lawyer. Thanks for watching.